Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michelle Veazey, the Executive Director of New Hampshire Businesses for Social Responsibility, and we're really pleased to be able to offer this webinar today and bring the experts that we have to this conversation. If you're not familiar with NHBSR, we are a member organization with over 200 businesses and organizations that work to come together with our community stakeholders to improve our workplaces, our communities, and the environment, because we believe that New Hampshire will thrive when we bring the power of business and our people to build a sustainable and prosperous state for all. So today, our discussion towards strong public education is really grounded in the fact that we know that access to strong public education in New Hampshire helps to ensure a strong foundation for the health, prosperity, and overall well-being of all Granite Staters. Investments in public education from early childhood to higher education have the potential to provide long-term returns to our local communities, their residents, our businesses, and the overall New Hampshire economy. The state of New Hampshire has a fundamental responsibility to ensure that every Granite State child has the opportunity to receive a high-quality public education. Yet for years, the resources the state provides to local communities has fallen short of what schools need to help children learn and thrive. Let's learn more about the challenge and how we can have a positive impact. We have an amazing group of leaders today, so I'll start with our moderator, Jeff Feingold. Jeff is the editor of the New Hampshire Business Review, where he has worked for a total of 28 years. He's been named as the New Hampshire Press Association's Writer of the Year and Editorial Writer of the Year, and has also been published in the New York Times and The Nation. He spent much of his career covering government and politics at the local, state, and national levels, and he's been a regular panelist on public affairs shows on both public and commercial TV and radio. So we're excited to have Jeff moderate this discussion today. And we also have fantastic panelists. I'll start with Richard Ackerman, who's a business leader with over 25 years of industry experience. He currently operates Red River's workforce development strategy. Red River harnesses the power of technology to support customers in the commercial, civilian, defense, intelligence, healthcare, and SLED markets. You're going to have to tell us what SLED stands for, Richard. The Red River Workforce Development Team focuses on 4 major functional areas, including employee development, academy and Think Smart programs, OEM partner and university programs, and thought leadership and training. We also have Zach Sheehan, who is the project director of the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project and is responsible for guiding the design and implementation of their long-term vision, crafting policy strategies, and leading its efforts to attain comprehensive, lasting, and equitable reform of New Hampshire's school funding system. Before joining NHSFFP, that's tougher than NHBSR, but Zach was a legislative assistant in the New Hampshire House and a field organizer with the Campaign for a Family-Friendly Economy. And finally, last but not least, we are happy to have Michael Turmel, who has also participated on other panels with us at our spring conference. Michael is the Director of Education and Career Initiatives at New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. Michael works with a team of professionals who are focused on equity, racial justice, and opportunity in education from cradle to career. And prior to his work at the foundation, Michael worked in both higher education and public schools for 26 years. Just a couple of logistics that I want to share with you before we get started. The webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link in a follow-up email along with the contact information for our speakers. And we'll be providing some links today to some material they've provided, but those links will also be provided to you in the follow-up email. And I want to encourage everyone to enter your questions in the chat window as the discussion proceeds, because we'll get to your questions probably halfway through the conversation. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Jeff and our wonderful panel.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle. I have to say, I'm honored to be asked to moderate this discussion. And I just want to start for a second. That biography of me is a little old, but that's okay because it's not 28 years. It's more like 40 something years.
I was going to say,
but which is relevant to what I want to say, because I just want to say before we start that I've been in New Hampshire since 1981. And my first job in New Hampshire was working in Newport, New Hampshire as a journalist. And my first place I lived was Claremont. So at the very beginning, I had a very, very close view of the inequities of the education, the funding system in New Hampshire. And I just really wanted to make clear that this has been going on for such a long time. This has been an intractable problem. I go as far back as before the Claremont suit. There was another suit by the town of Marlborough, which we don't have to get into, but led eventually to the Claremont lawsuits. And I think that that's something that we really need to keep in mind, how long we've been going through this and having this discussion in New Hampshire. I'm not trying to discourage anybody, but we have to keep on doing this to talk about it. So anyway, I want to thank the panelists. And I think maybe what I'd like to do is first get each one of the panelists to give us an idea of what their idea is in terms of the education system in New Hampshire, adequate funding, and basically what they think that might look like. So maybe I'd like to start with Michael first, if that's fine with you, Michael.
That's fine with me, Jeff. First off, I want to thank all the folks who are gathered joining us today on this webinar. I'll focus some of my comments primarily on business, sort of business entities, but I recognize that there are a number of folks in attendance who are from different sectors as well. This conversation is incredibly important, and unfortunately, businesses play a very outsized role in our communities, but unfortunately, they are sometimes not as informed as we would like in terms of understanding how all of these systems work together. So your voices are critical to this. We welcome and encourage any businesses who are interested in learning more about this to really become more engaged. We also know that a strong business voice is often lacking in important places where decisions are made about situations like this, the public education in New Hampshire, which is what we're talking about today. I'll give you just a little bit of a teaser that I think there are at least 4 very distinct reasons why New Hampshire businesses ought to be active in this space. And I'll leave that teaser for you, and hopefully we get to those 4 reasons later on. In terms of the Charitable Foundation, we're a community foundation, which reaches all corners of New Hampshire, and we're deeply invested in all of our communities. And we have come to this education conundrum. It's as Jeff said, it's long-standing historical problem. Back in 2016, the Charitable Foundation created a new initiative called New Hampshire Tomorrow, which is a cradle to career youth opportunity initiative, trying to make sure that all of our children have access to the types of things they need to thrive in their lives here in New Hampshire. In addition to that 10-year commitment back in 2016, we've recently recommitted through our new strategic plan, Together We Thrive, which focuses on equity and racial justice. We've recommitted to this concept of equitable education in New Hampshire. Jeff, we have at least 2 huge challenges that face us regarding a strong education system here in New Hampshire. The first is the funding inequity that we currently face community by community. It's pervasive throughout our state. And we know after decades of Supreme Court rulings that our system as it currently exists is unconstitutional. And the legislature has been working for years sort of around the edges to solve that problem, but we have a far way to go. Currently, right now, unfortunately, outcomes in our communities for students is oftentimes based on zip code, where we have communities that have a lot of resources to put toward public education. And I believe Zach is going to break all that information down for us. And we have communities that really struggle to provide the resources. In addition to the longstanding school funding equity issue, we have a lot of short-term threats challenging our public education system, undermining the important role that public schools play in our communities. Efforts to privatize and unbundle services from schools, voucher programs which steer money away from the public school system into private, religious, and homeschool. We have laws on the books which prohibit the teachings of certain concepts in New Hampshire, a true and historical perspective on our past. We've moved away from local control and are moving more authority into the State Department of Education, away from local school boards. And all of that is contributing to an erosion of the important role that schools play in our communities and our civic lives. I'll stop there and look forward to chatting a little bit more with the panel and with our guests as we move forward.
Thanks so much, Richard. Michael, and I just will speak ahead of myself because I'd like Richard, now that Michael mentioned the role of businesses. Richard, maybe you could talk a little bit about from your perspective.
Sure. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you all for having me today as part of the panel. I bring a couple of perspectives which I think are helpful for the conversation today. First, I'm the parent of students here in the state of New Hampshire. Secondly, I'm an employer here in New Hampshire. Red River's headquarters is actually in Claremont, New Hampshire. But I'm also a graduate here of Stevens High School. All right, and Jeff, you alluded to where one of the suits around adequate funding originated, right? So as a student in the 80s and the 90s, I had some interesting experiences, right? So as I think about the outcomes, right, and Michael had mentioned that what's meaningful to me is well-rounded employees, but also well-rounded community members, right? We're all taxpayers here in the state. We're excited for employment opportunities and strong community members. I think the opportunities for businesses are certainly to get engaged. You need to be part of the solution, right? It's easy to throw your hands up and say, oh gosh, there's not skilled people, there's not available people, right? There are all these types of challenges and things. Here at Red River, we've built a high school-based extended learning opportunity program. And Michelle, have to keep me honest because I will just spout acronyms all day, and I apologize for that. But the ELO program, Extended Learning Opportunity, Kim Baca and I here at Red River advisors for a number of our local high schools, and we saw gaps in STEM education in particular that we saw a great opportunity to step up and build a program, and we did. This will be our 9th year that we'll have run this program, and it's a mix of business skills, technology skills, financial literacy, right? And we know how important that is because now it's a mandate here in the state. We partnered with our local bank here, Claremont Savings Bank, to participate in those activities. And so there are opportunities because, as Michael said, right, the problem is real. It's well documented, it's well defined. I think Zach's going to go into that a little bit further, but there are opportunities for organizations, businesses to step up and help be part of the solution. You know, I think another example that I would certainly highlight, Red River has some great partnerships with the Bruins Foundation. And so throughout New England, we have been retrofitting schools to bring their STEAM, right? So science, technology, engineering, arts, and math up to par. So, you know, putting in computers, radio communication equipment, tablets, the right software and those different components, again, so that we can help where there are gaps as we see it as employers, really to kind of help out and drive those programs. You know, I think it's easy to talk about the reading, writing, the arithmetic, but well-rounded individuals, again, have that STEM background, civics and humanities backgrounds, which we think are incredibly important, but also athletics, theater, things of that nature to make them just better employees and more well-rounded. I think the other thing that I would highlight as a board member with the community college system, and again, I don't speak for the board, I don't speak for the community college system, I'm speaking for myself, but also that as a parent, We've got some great programs through the colleges to help, running start, e-start programs. Again, things that are being done, and businesses can be involved in those programs as well to help. And I think, those are the things that I would highlight and I think are critically important, Jeff.
Thanks, Richard. Zach, you're coming from a little different area from the other two guys. And if you could talk a little about, first of all, what your thoughts on this and also the School Funding Fairness Project.
Absolutely. And I want to echo Michael and Richard, and thanks for being here and inviting us to participate in this webinar. So a lot of the work I do is giving like 45-minute presentations. So I'm going to do my best to keep this in just a few minutes, but we'll see. So what I would like to kind of do is get into a little bit of some of the details about kind of how our system is set up and the specific inequities that have been alluded to. Here at the School Funding Fairness Project, we do a lot of work educating people, elected officials, school board members, community members, teachers, groups like this, just about how our schools are funded, the role of property taxes, and why we think that should be changed. But at a high level, we really have good public education in this state, and it's something that people across the state are really proud of, and we do a really good job in a lot of ways. But something we try to focus on is that those averages do kind of obscure a lot of the inequities baked into specifically certain communities around the state that kind of have these compounding inequities. Claremont's been mentioned a few times. And so a few things to kind of throw out so people can get a sense of the scale of the problem. At a high level, the state only provides about $4,600 in what they call adequacy funding per student to each school district. The problem is that it costs and districts spend closer to $18,000 per student. And so that gap there is largely made up by local property taxes. And that wouldn't really be a problem if the number of students and the property values around the state were equally distributed. But clearly they're not. And I think someone mentioned already kind of outcomes can be related to zip codes. And that largely is because we have, communities around the state that have really high property values simply because they happen to be next to a lake or a ski mountain or the seacoast. And what this results in, and I think for folks on the call today, thinking about kind of some of the implications for businesses specifically, is wildly varying property tax rates around the state that are needed to fund our education system, to the tune of close to $6 per thousand in Portsmouth, and $16 in Milford, $9 in New London, and $15 up in Claremont. And what this means is that, some of these communities are paying a lot more for their schools, trying to pay a lot more, trying to tax a lot higher, right? But not getting as much funding. And something that Richard mentioned that I think is really important also is, our schools are well beyond doing the basics, reading, writing, arithmetic, to prepare our students to succeed in today's workforce or in however they want to be, adults in our community. They need access to technology. They need access to a whole host of other opportunities, arts, culture, extracurricular activities, and the really different resources available to different school districts, primarily because the state does not provide enough money and we rely heavily on property taxes, means that school districts have, students at different schools some might have access to 2 or 3 AP classes, some might have access to 25. Some might have a computer lab that's fully outfitted, and some might have none at all and need to go to a nearby school district. And that's really not something, from our perspective, that we think our school district, our school system in the state should have access be so different across the state. And so to kind of, to round out kind of where we as an organization come into this, we're a 501c3 nonprofit, but we do a lot of work in the kind of education and advocacy space, really making sure that people understand both the system and how the system is set up. And to something, from Jeff's point, this is a long-standing issue. And so part of what we're trying to do is come in and really shift focus, shift attention onto who is responsible for upholding this, which is state law. This is the state legislature. specifically through the state budget process. It's a political process, but both parties have, both Republicans, Democrats have not fixed this. This is kind of a bipartisan in unwillingness to address this at a systematic level. And so what we do is, try to focus and shift people's attention towards our state, our candidates running for office right now, your election coming up, making sure that you're engaging with them, asking them questions, making sure they understand this issue, and really, from a business perspective, and Michelle mentioned I'd spent some time as a staff member here in Concord of the State House. Businesses do have a really powerful voice in our community, especially a lot of our smaller businesses. And so making sure that you're able to make those connections and speak to them like Richard can. I'm not I don't run a business like Richard does, to be able to speak to workforce issues, housing issues, the connection to the traction and retention of young families, and why that matters that we, legislators take solving and addressing how we fund our public education system and the inequities baked in there. And so you have a really, powerful voice. So I'm really excited to be here, and can get way more into the weeds as the questions permit, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks very much, Zach. Now, before I get moving on this, I just want to say that, you are encouraged, please, to ask any questions you have. And I know we have a couple of coming in already, but I want to just kind of set the stage for this, because as I said, as each one of our panelists has mentioned also, is that this has been going on a long time. And recently, like in the last few months, Andrew Valinsky and John Tobin, who filed the original Claremont suit back in, I think that was 1989 or something like that, they filed another suit, they're doing another challenge, the school funding situation, along with Natalie LaFlamme, who apparently believe was a student at Berlin High School. Well, I'm not even in high school, but she was a student, came up through the Berlin schools, and we've done a couple of stories in our publication about this, and maybe Zach, and if you other guys, Richard and Michael, want to just chime in also, please do. But Zach, could you put in perspective what this most recent lawsuit is and why it's being filed right now?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And just want to say at the outset that as an organization, we're supportive of the direction of this lawsuit and trying to work to get people to understand it. But we are not a plaintiff in the lawsuit. We're not suing the state, which as few people have thought we were doing that. But basically, this new lawsuit, which is Rand versus the State of New Hampshire, Rand being the last name of the first name plaintiff, is, as opposed to school districts suing the state, like is happening in the ongoing Conval lawsuit some of you might have heard of. This is the perspective of taxpayers, and some of them are business owners. And what the suit is alleging is that because the state is supposed to fund our public education system per some of the Claremont decisions in our Constitution with uniform taxes, but we rely so heavily on local property taxes that are absolutely not uniform, their constitutional rights are being violated. And they also point out specifically that the statewide education property tax, which is pretty complicated, but is not actually a state tax because of the way it's raised and collected, that system itself is also unconstitutional. So it's kind of a very explicit other side of the coin, as opposed to the Conval lawsuit, which is arguing that the state's not giving enough money. And I think one way to think about this in terms of the kind of absurdity of the system is, it would be pretty ridiculous if you went out to eat in Portsmouth and paid a different rooms and meals tax than if you did in Concord or Berlin or Claremont, right? That's a tax that is equal and uniform across the state, goes to the state coffers, and they spend it as the legislature determines. But if you live in a certain place like Portsmouth versus Claremont, you pay wildly different property tax rates, largely which are used to fund our school systems.
Great. Yeah, it's hard to hear this when you've mentioned this stuff, because I've been hearing this kind of talk for so long, as I mentioned. Anyway, I wanted to get this going here, asking Michael, we're talking about the role of businesses, and you mentioned there were 4 reasons for businesses to be active in this issue. If you want to talk about that, and I'm sure we might have some input from Richard and Zach as well, but Michael, if you could start this off with your 4 reasons.
Oh, yeah, sure, Jeff. Thank you. And I think, you know, some of these have already been alluded to, both by Jeff and by Zach. First and foremost, having a strong public education system is inextricably linked to having a qualified and available workforce. And we know the challenges that New Hampshire businesses, particularly small businesses, are facing today to hire skilled employees. And certainly having well-educated K-12 public school students who also have great opportunities for higher education here in New Hampshire is critical to meeting businesses' workforce needs. Secondly, as Zach alluded to just a moment ago in explaining the new lawsuit, many businesses own properties, and they don't always understand how their property tax bill is calculated and how much of that property tax bill is going to fund public schools, and how the different tax rates in their communities might look different if they happen to have their business in a different community. So certainly the inequitable funding system hurts business owners who own property and pay taxes on those properties. Third component I would say is that we know that thriving businesses survive in strong communities, and schools are at the heart of those strong communities. They are often literally the one place where people gather on a routine basis to go to vote, to attend open houses, to go to sporting events, to go to plays. They are in many cases the heart of the community. And then the last piece is for businesses to thrive in these strong communities. Oftentimes, if you look, for example, when, as Zach said, having not only keeping our students and young people, young families here in New Hampshire, but how are we attracting them? And for folks who are relocating to New Hampshire, we know by working with real estate folks, for example, the number one question they ask is the strength of the school system in the community that they're considering moving to. And again, this is sort of a cyclical thing, right? So if the community's struggling and their schools are struggling, it's often difficult to sell properties and to encourage folks and young families to move into those communities. So those are four. I mean, I could probably rattle off a few more, but those are four that I kind of default to.
Richard or Zach, do you have any thoughts on this?
Jeff, if I could chime in, I think a couple of things, and those are those are great points, Michael. Many of us have read the Communities and Consequences book, right? That speaks about some of the challenges that we're experiencing here in the state, and in some parts, certainly throughout New England. But the aging population is certainly an interesting challenge for us. Workforce housing, right? So Michael brought the point up as taxpayers. Everyone goes to the Zillow link or the realtor.com and looks to see how the schools are rated in those communities. And that directly impacts all of our property values, not just short, but certainly long term. But I think the other piece from a workforce development standpoint, if businesses aren't getting great talent, they can't continue to grow. We've got we're losing people from the state, right? So the great state system for education, both at the K to 12, but also associate bachelor degree type programs. People are leaving the state if there aren't great opportunities here for employment. And so I think there's that balance. If we've got great employees, businesses can grow and thrive and continue to great opportunities, and we don't lose those wonderful community members to other parts of the country, right? We maintain them, and that's an important part of the education system, right? So that we're growing and building and maintaining our really strong communities.
Great. And Zach, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think Michael and Richard really covered what I was going to speak to.
Okay, great. Because I wanted to get into this. I have a question from one of the audience members, and it's specifically about this. So can you provide any data or sources on public schools being, quote, inextricably linked to having a more qualified and capable workforce? So I think Michael maybe mention that specific, I think she's quoting you, so.
Yeah, I can take that. I can field that,
Okay,
Jeff, if
great.
you'd like me to. And so the data that I will share with you, I admit, is a couple years old, and there hasn't been an update post-pandemic. But I suspect, given what we know about, for example, job openings in New Hampshire, that the data is still very relevant and accurate. There has been a lot of focus nationally, but also in New Hampshire, around workforce challenges, and particularly around education and skill set needed to meet the demands of the workforce. And for those of you who were working on workforce and education issues a couple of years ago, you might recognize the term 65 by 25. That was a movement, an initiative to try to address this problem of not having a skilled workforce ready to meet the demands of the jobs that were available in New Hampshire. And the data that was collected through a variety of means, including the census data, was that in New Hampshire by the year 2025, fully 70% of all jobs available in the state would require some post-secondary learning, some credential, license, or degree, 70%. And at the time, 2 years ago, that meant that we currently had a shortfall of about 50,000 skilled people to fill these jobs. So that's just one data point I can throw at you. I'm sure there are many more.
Great, thanks. Do the other panelists have any thoughts on this before I move on? I don't want to not call on you if you have something to say.
The one thing I'd like to add is, and I did see another question pop up, so it's kind of related, but I'm thinking specifically of teachers as a workforce and the kind of link to the amount of funding available and the way our education funding system works to the ability to attract, retain qualified teachers. There is absolutely a link there, and I'm going to shout out Reaching Higher New Hampshire, which is another great organization in the state. They just put out recently an updated review of teacher salary data that kind of lays out the ability to starting salaries of teachers in different districts, the connections to equalized value per pupil. So that's just another way that within the school system specifically that this problem compounds.
Yeah. To something that Richard mentioned, we have a comment here that about, I would like to think that businesses also consider the quality of the schools when deciding where to locate, just like their employees do, and this has cross-generational impact. The younger members of working families won't be here if the parents are not finding what they need. And I think that's a really good point to think about. Richard, is that something that you were thinking along those lines as well?
Sure. And I think, I can speak to the Red River history, right, which is pretty fascinating when you think about funding and things of that nature. Red River is a company started in '95 in Hanover. Red River moved to Lebanon, and Red River has been here in Claremont in these beautiful renovated mill buildings. Since I think I want to say 05 kind of time frame, right? And so, yeah, we made a decision, right, to be in a community where a lot of our employees are. And again, there's been some great, economic kind of growth here in Claremont. Chinburg has renovated a beautiful building right next to us, and the workforce, the housing was gobbled up, right? So yes, I think those are certainly considerations that companies make in terms of where they're going to have their headquarters and so on and so forth, for sure.
Okay. Also, Richard, now that we have you here, I have a question here that's been lingering since the beginning, so I should really ask this. I don't want to lose this one because it's actually very interesting. It was about what you were saying about your company's ELO program, Extended Learning Opportunity Program. Why is the New Hampshire Department of Education so committed to privatization when keeping improvements within the community school is working?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Ever thought about?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I don't know necessarily that I have the answer to that, right? I think, again, I've been, as a parent, I've been very impressed with the VLAX opportunities, right, that are available through the Running Start, the eStart programs, through the community colleges. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know that I can answer that one.
I'll add one comment if you don't mind, Jeff.
Sure.
I think it's important to note that, you know, when we look at the challenges that are facing our education system in New Hampshire, whether it's privatization or unbundling of services, challenges to curriculum, book bans, those types of things. I think it's important to note that these are definitely local issues because many of them are, you know, being raised at local school boards. They're local in that, you know, sometimes the issues are being introduced in the legislature in New Hampshire. But there's also a national component to this that I want to make sure that folks understand, that many of the things that are happening in New Hampshire are part of a larger national strategy, which, if the strategy succeeds, will dismantle public education in our state. There are some forces at work and well-funded. They're well-resourced. They have a plan, and you know, the challenges that we're facing here in New Hampshire, you can see these same challenges in places like Arizona, Colorado, Florida, for example. We just happen to be really ripe for this type of sort of nefarious activity because our legislature is so large, because our legislators are so close to community. It's a body that where lots of different things can be introduced, and sometimes they gain traction. But this is definitely part of a more sophisticated, larger strategy than just New Hampshire.
Yeah, I have a question that's kind of related. It occurs to me because there's been much of the criticism about these efforts to funnel money to, let's say, the voucher system or other things, you know, other kinds of aspects of privatization. That money, how is that money connected to the money that's being spent on public schools? And is it really, in fact, limiting the resources even more? Does anyone there have an answer to that question or put some perspective on it?
Yeah, I can start with that. So I think that with the current voucher program, otherwise known as the education freedom accounts, and there was just new data came out within the past month or so, and there's been some good reporting on it, the Bulletin and other publications, but so people get on average, I think it's between $4,000 and $5,000 for students who enroll in that voucher program. One of the problems is that many of the students, to the tune of $10 or $11 million so far, were never actually we're not in the public school system recently. So it's money that would have been going to public schools that is now going to students that were already homeschooled or at private schools. And I think one of the challenges there is, as you know, we talked about already, and I could go into a lot more detail, we don't have millions of dollars just sitting around our public education system to be kind of pushing outside of it, right? And there are good, as Richard mentioned, opportunities that might not be in traditional public schools, but most of our students go to public schools. And we already underfund them, so diverting more funds away from them is absolutely not helping the problem. And this voucher program specifically is one of the most open and loose in the country. And it's really hard to tell kind of like how much it will swell. So I think those are some of the concerns we have relative to where that money is going.
Great. I also have a question here that's related to the lawsuit discussion we were having. The legislature does not seem to care much about the verdicts in any of these lawsuits or the fact that the current system is unconstitutional. I think that's pretty undisputed fact. Are there any enforcement mechanisms in the decisions that can force their hand, or must we solely rely on public awareness and political pressure?
I'll add just a comment there, Jeff. First and foremost, I will say that I think it is a little unfair to paint the entire legislative branch with the same brush, because I'm looking at the attendance here and I see Dick Ames on the call. There are a number of legislators who over the years have tried to introduce bills that would solve this problem. So we do have folks that are actively working on this. We just haven't had anything comprehensive that has been done to solve that problem yet. In terms of an enforcement mechanism, there have been in other states the same kind of process that New Hampshire has gone through with decade after decade of lawsuits, with finding that the current system is unconstitutional. There have been in other states instances where those state Supreme Courts have said, enough, we did put this in the hands of the legislature, but after 20 some odd years, we're actually going to take a position. And in some cases, the Supreme Court in those other states have actually tried to rectify the problem. That's always a potential here in New Hampshire, but it's obviously uncertain. And the clearest path forward is for our legislature to deal with this problem.
And one thing, if I could add to that is, I think, I try to be optimistic about this, given that I have not been working on it for decades, so I'm bringing a little bit of my naive optimism to it. But I think something that is really unique about kind of the next 6 to 9 months here in New Hampshire specifically is the Conval lawsuit. In theory, is going to have its trial later or early next year, April-ish, I think, which is right in the middle of the budget season. So the budget is written in New Hampshire every 2 years. So it'll be right in the middle as when the House and the Senate are working on the budget. So you kind of have this opportunity to both use the lawsuit, highlight some of the issues, pull some things that are being said in the courtroom, right? Engage in that aspect, raise public awareness, and focus attention towards the actual process at the legislative level that would fix this. And just to, legislators do understand this. To go back to Representative Ames, who was just mentioned, one of his bills that he's worked on was just talked about at a work session last week. And one of the conversations was, there's another lawsuit happening. We at the legislature really need to be taking this seriously and working on this. And the Ways and Means Committee voted favorably to, try to address this next session and continue working on SWEPT specifically in some of the ways we raise money. So the legislature does listen on that front, but it does take, continued pressure and support and awareness from the public to kind of keep them honest, support the people who are working on it, and move that forward.
I'm not to dwell on this too much, but I just wanted to pipe in. I know I'm the moderator here, but I just want to say that the recent construction of the legislature in the last couple of sessions does not give you much optimism on on actually this issue being actually addressed for a long-term way of solving anything. But that's just an editorial comment on my part. I'm taking advantage. I have the microphone right here. Anyway,
Jeff, there has been some real success in the legislature, though. Draw attention to the Commission to Study School Funding. Actually did a comprehensive study over the course of a full year with outside research firms and other vendors who contributed, that actually quantified what the difference is in outcomes for students in property-rich versus property-strapped communities. And it actually puts forth sort of a roadmap for how we might address this as a state. And that was a legislative process. And there have been bills introduced, and I suspect that there will be some looking at the LSRs that have been filed for this year that actually use that commission report as a roadmap to introduce comprehensive legislation to address this issue.
If I could add something that I think would be helpful.
Go ahead, Fred. I just wanted to say, people, this is Fred Bramante, who's well known for focusing on education for many, many years. So
thank you so much, Jeff. And I've been on this education funding thing for very, very many years. I got to argue before the New Hampshire Supreme Court, and I see back in 1999 when pretty much the same situation that we're in now, that the legislature wasn't about to do anything, and what happened was the Claremont lawsuit basically got to the Supreme Court and clearly showed the court how the model of education funding that was in place back then was unconstitutional. And so the court declared it unconstitutional and gave the general court until I believe the date was like April 30th of 1999 or something like that. But it was a specific day that if you don't have it solved by then, then we are going to declare the education funding system for the state of New Hampshire unconstitutional, and therefore, and ultimately, the implication was that why should anybody pay taxes that are unconstitutional taxes? So to me, so the general court made a kicking and screaming, said okay to the state property tax, and put a plan in place that they have greatly backed off from since the time it was put in place, and back to me in the same position of being unconstitutional. And so to me, if you can, if the case is clearly made that this system is an unconstitutional system, where Part 2, Article 5 of the New Hampshire Constitution says that all taxes must be proportional. And if you can prove, which I think is an easy thing to prove, that that's not the case, then and the Supreme Court does the same thing that it did back in '99, which is basically say you have an unconstitutional system, and in essence, and we're going to declare it so by a certain date, if unless you come up with a solution to fix it. So ultimately, the court, they weren't happy that they had to make a decision on changing the system that existed at that time.
Okay, Fred, just to let you know, we have a hard stop at 1, so I really wanted to get the discussion going. Anyway, I have a question here from another participant, another member of the audience. And I'd like some perspectives from our panel. All over the country, we have a competing market of businesses. Our college system operates in a competing market. Public schools have had a, excuse me, public schools have had a monopoly on education and curriculum for so many years. Many of the school boards don't even engage with the public any longer. Many school systems are prioritizing social emotional learning over the basics and future workforce needs. More students are disruptive in the classroom with no fear of consequences. Why is there a resistance to bring in a competitive market to our education system? Many parents don't want their children exposed to some of the current environments. Can I just say that's a lot of generalizations there, but if you guys would take a shot at these, at this question or questions. Anybody?
I can start, and I want to echo that. I think that there's a lot of generalizations there that I don't know are true across the state. But I think something, and actually I had a similar question come up in a presentation we were doing in Exeter recently. I think that the current system we have does not allow, in my mind, our schools to operate in the question here is phrased as competitive. Another way to think about it might be creative or innovative way by restricting and putting schools in such kind of a rigged system with so limited money that need to rely so heavily on local property taxes. So I would, we are advocating for a system under which individual schools can be more creative, do have more flexibility, do have the ability to try to meet the individual needs of their students, which I think a lot of them, to Richard's point, is making sure they are ready for the workforce or post-secondary education if that's what they want to go to, or the military, et cetera, right? And so I think right now the system we have strips a lot of local control, strips a lot of the ability of school districts to be creative, innovative, meet the individual needs of their community, of their students, by dramatically underfunding them and placing the burden so heavily on local property taxes. So, just at a high level, yeah, I definitely think we don't have a system that is supportive in that way. And part of what we're advocating for and pushing for is to try to allow school districts and administrators and the teachers around the state to meet those needs in the creative, equitable ways they can.
Thanks. Also, I just wanted to ask a question that came from before, and I think it's kind of interesting. It plays into this idea of funding equity. is there a connection? Well, what is the connection between teacher salaries and community school performance? Is there, Michael, maybe you have an idea, or Zach?
Well,
Richard,
I mean,
don't know, but if you could have, if you give some perspective on that.
I have a thought, Jeff, and it's not the complete answer, but I will just share with you some of the challenges I've seen across the state in my work with local school districts. Those districts that struggle to raise property taxes to pay for schools, oftentimes, as has been mentioned, very property wealthy communities can pay very high salaries and attract qualified individuals who stay a very long time in that system. And those teachers, when they stay in those communities, develop expertise year after year after year. We see just the opposite happening in communities that are not able to fund their schools as well, where teacher salaries are depressed. And perhaps those might be a great school for a young teacher to begin their career, cut their teeth, learn a little bit about the teaching craft. But when an opportunity arises to quite literally go to the community next door, travel 5 minutes further, perhaps in my car, but make $20,000 more per year, that young teacher then leaves that community and moves on. And we see, for example, and I'll just give you one statistic. Again, this is a couple of years old, but the community of Pittsfield has struggled to pay a high teacher salary. Their salaries are quite low. And year over year, they have 30, sometimes 40% teacher turnover. So they're never quite able to build up that level of expertise within their teaching core where they can continue to build upon success after success after success to build up their system. So they're constantly in churn, bringing new people in. And just as one data point, it costs on average about $30,000 to train a new teacher when you bring a new teacher into a school district. That's years and years of professional development to keep them moving forward and learning and growing in their craft. If you're constantly in churn, not only are you rebuilding from ground zero every year, but you're actually spending a lot of money to just keep the wheels turning rather than build the workforce.
Yeah, it's just to that point. My wife was a public school teacher for over 35 years. And I know that, and my kids both went to the school district that she taught in. And I know there were a lot of really good young teachers in that district over the years. And so many of them who would be teaching for 4 or 5 years, they left to go to places like Hanover, Bow, other higher paying school districts, because they had the opportunities. And these were talented young teachers who chose higher pay because why they have families and that was their choice. So that's one of the other problems with the widespread inequities in our funding system and the resources available. Anyway, I think we have time for another question or two, but I just wanted to go back to what you guys what we've been talking about in terms of businesses. What specifically should businesses be doing? Go in the legislature? What could they do? What could a business owner do right now, or manager, to really get something going on this issue?
I'm happy to chime in, Jeff. So, part of the reason that we wanted to share our template for what we're doing with the Think Smart program is others, right? We're excited for other businesses to leverage that model, to use it. And again, through the partnership that we've got with the Claremont Savings Bank, right? There's other great programs. I know here, Fuji and Hypotherm run great programs, right? Extended learning opportunities. Businesses have the opportunity to get involved and continue to provide the hands-on real-world experience for the students across the districts. And there are lots of businesses that do that. We think about, the certifications that students get, the degrees, right, the diplomas and the experience. Those are the things that we're looking for as employers. And I think there's great opportunity certainly there. Certainly the other piece is work with your local representatives, right? To ask, to look for the things that you're expecting so that your businesses can continue to thrive, again, with that strong workforce. And that's, to me, those are very simple and direct things that that every business throughout the state can be doing today.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll add a few things on that. And I think I want to just, kind of like highlight what Richard said. One of the most powerful things is to be showing positive examples of what both our education system can achieve and a lot of the creative collaborations that Richard's been mentioning throughout the hour here. Like, make sure people know about those, because those models that they're doing at Red River could be used in Berlin, could be used in Portsmouth if they're not. Like, more people should know about that. We have a lot of amazing programs happening in New Hampshire right now. So learning from each other, absolutely a way that businesses can kind of uplift the positive things happening. And then to kind of go more directly to the legislative piece, which Richard mentioned as well, make sure we have 800 something candidates running for office right now, right? That's a lot of people that you can call and talk to and say and ask if they understand this issue, what they're going to be doing about it, making sure they understand it. Going to your local school board connecting with them is important too. We have part of our advocacy work that we're doing. We're working on getting businesses signed on to a pretty general petition, just saying we want this issue to be highlighted and addressed. I think Zena will put that in the chat. And then we're always, working with folks to write letters to the editor, understand how to talk to their elected officials, making sure that this is just out and being talked about more. And then as we get into the legislative session, a lot more targeted testimony, calling legislators in specific communities or committees, excuse me. So those are some of the ideas I have right now.
And Michael, I'll give you the last word on this.
Well, I'll just say, Jeff, in my mind, they say in New Hampshire, all government is local government. So first and foremost, I say to businesses who want to get involved, yes, there are a number of nonprofit organizations that you could contribute to that are working on this issue. Yes, you could sign on to a lawsuit or work with somebody to write an amicus brief supporting the lawsuits. But really, most people want to get involved at the local level. So get involved with your local school board. Understand what it is that they're trying to do. Look at the policies that they're trying to pass. If your local school board is trying to pass restrictive policies on banning books, for example, that's something that, the fruits of that may come years down the road when students are neglected experiences that they ought to have in terms of workforce development and the connections to business. But that is something that impacts your entire community. And I just want to sort of, my last 2 cents is to say, we've had a lot of conversation today about, business and taxes and privatization, but at the heart of this are kids. And we can't lose sight of the important community aspect that happens in our schools to bring communities together, to have shared experiences, to raise a group of kids who will later go on and hopefully be productive citizens. And that happens in our local public schools. And we can't ignore or lose sight of the fact that we're talking about children here and what's best for kids, and giving them the best opportunity we can give them to survive and to thrive here in New Hampshire.
It's a good last word. Michelle, I'll leave it to you. I just want to say, I know you have a petition that you might be asking people to sign. So I want to thank all of you for tuning in. And Michelle, thank you for the opportunity that you're giving us today to discuss this issue.
Well, I want to thank all of our panelists. You have been incredible in sharing your knowledge and perspective, and I think it's some very important conversations here and ones that we'll continue to have. I do want to kind of chime in on that last message about what businesses can do. A couple of years ago, we had opposition to the divisive concepts language in the state, which Michael actually mentioned as well. And I think the strength of the business community standing up and saying that this is not language that we feel belongs in New Hampshire really helped to remove some of the impacts. There's still a lot of impacts in our school system that we need to work on, but I just bring it up because it is a way, it was a very obvious way that the business community was able to speak out and against something that they felt very strongly impacted the business community. And I think that our education system is at the same level, that we need to speak out and share what is important to really build a strong economy in our state. So thank you all, and thank you for all the great conversations in the chat. I want to mention a couple of upcoming events that I think have particular relevance to this audience. We are launching a new workplace mental wellness program, and I invite you all to take a look at it. It is nhbsr.org/BIM. It has monthly webinars from experts in the field, as well as opportunities for businesses and organizations to sign up for a weekly subscription to be able to allow all of your employees to participate in stress reduction sessions for 30 minutes once a week. So it's a great opportunity. Take a look at the website. There's much more to it than that. And so we really hope that you'll consider it. We also have our Sustainability Slam on November 3rd. And one of the things that's highlighted there are the innovative things that companies are doing in workplaces and in their communities. And so those stories will be highlighted as well. And finally, I want to mention at the beginning of the year, we will once again be offering our workplace diversity. We've renamed it from Racial Equity Program to Diversity and Inclusion Program. That also isn't open to the public, so keep your eyes out for that. If you don't receive our newsletters, please feel free to respond to Zena's email tomorrow and let her know that you'd like to be included, because we do invite all of our stakeholders. We are not just an organization for the business community, but also for our communities at large and our education system. So we welcome all of you to participate in our programming. But again, I want to thank our panelists and thank Jeff Feingold today. Always love the conversations that come out of these opportunities. So thanks so much, and we'll look forward to seeing you all soon.